My friends, Paulo, Lucas, Ricardo, and I, had decided to spend the weekend in a forest far from the city, the kind of place that didn't appear on maps and was several hours away. We wanted to escape our routines, turn off our phones, and enjoy a few days of complete isolation. We knew there would be no cell signal or any kind of infrastructure, and that's exactly what made the place ideal for us. The forest was known for being scarcely visited, with few tourist reports and poorly marked trails. We left the city early, just as the sun was rising, carrying tents, supplies, and everything we'd need for 2 days of camping. The car ride was long, with few stops. When we finally arrived, the place was exactly what we had imagined: dense, tall trees, a deep silence, and trails that disappeared into the vegetation. The clearing where we decided to set up camp was spacious and relatively open, allowing us a wide view of the surroundings. The environment seemed perfect for the rest we were seeking. After setting up the tents, we decided to explore the area around the campsite. The clearing was surrounded by tall, sparse trees that let the sunlight pass through irregularly, casting shadow patterns on the ground. The trails that branched through the forest were barely visible, with vegetation growing over them, but we pressed on, carrying flashlights and backpacks with some supplies. As we walked, the sound of dry leaves under our feet was the only thing breaking the silence. The wind swayed the branches high in the trees, and from time to time, we heard distant birds. Lucas led the way, clearing a path with a stick he had brought, while Paulo and Ricardo made jokes, trying to ease the tension that was beginning to set in from the lack of any sign of other human beings. We returned to the clearing in the late afternoon after a few hours of hiking and began to prepare the campfire. We used twigs and dry branches we had collected during the day, forming a small pile in the center of the camp. The sky was clear, and the first star appeared on the horizon as we lit the fire. The light from the flames illuminated our tents and the area around us, creating a clear line between the clearing and the darkness of the forest. While we sat around the fire, the conversation flowed easily, and the atmosphere seemed relaxing. The crackling of the flames and the smell of burning wood filled the air, and everyone shared stories and laughs. However, as the night deepened, I noticed that the environment around us had changed. The silence, which had previously been a pleasant pause between conversations, became oppressive. The rustling of leaves and the birds' songs had given way to a disconcerting emptiness. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening. The firelight cast long, distorted shadows, and the trees seemed more menacing as the darkness advanced. Then I noticed something moving at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the movement was slow and deliberate, unlike any creature I had seen before. I stood up, trying to make sure it wasn't just an illusion caused by the light and the dark. As I approached the edge of the fire's glow, I could make out a figure leaning against a tree, not far from where we were. The silhouette was tall and thin, almost blending with the shadows of the trees themselves. I couldn't make out any features, but the presence seemed watchful, attentive. I alerted my friends, and everyone stood up, though a sense of hesitation took over the group. The unknown figure remained there for a few moments before turning and disappearing into the darkness of the forest without making any sound. We tried to ignore the incident, nervously laughing and returning to the conversation, but the feeling that something wasn't right persisted. The figure's gaze still lingered in our minds, and the light-hearted atmosphere we had enjoyed earlier now felt heavy and unsettling. After the figure disappeared into the darkness, the mood around the campfire completely shifted. The previous relaxation gave way to silent tension. No one laughed anymore, and the conversations became brief and cautious. Still, we tried to carry on, convincing ourselves that it was probably someone passing through on the trail, or just a larger animal. But the discomfort was palpable. As the hours passed, the feeling that something was wrong only intensified. Furtive glances were cast toward the edge of the clearing, but the figure did not reappear. Instead, the silence around us became suffocating. There were no more sounds of leaves rustling in the wind or nocturnal animals. It was as if the forest had closed in on us, watching us from the darkness. When we were ready to sleep, another strange detail began to bother us. Something was missing from our camp. One of my friend's sleeping bags had disappeared without any explanation. We searched the tents and nearby area, thinking he might have left it somewhere while setting up camp, but we couldn't find it. No one dared to say it out loud, but we all knew what we were thinking. The disappearance of the sleeping bag didn't seem like a simple organizational mistake. The absence of the figure, the silence of the forest, and now the vanishing of an object that had been with us all day. All these factors seemed interconnected, heightening the tension with every passing second. No one was willing to sleep. The campfire, which had once given us comfort, now felt like a vulnerable point in the middle of the darkness surrounding the camp. Every shadow cast by the flames seemed more threatening, and the feeling of being watched returned in full force. Shortly after midnight, when the silence had become almost unbearable, we heard the first sound. It wasn't loud, but enough to put everyone on alert. Something was moving around the camp. Slow, dragging steps that seemed to circle the tents. No one said a word, but we exchanged worried looks. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously began shining it toward the trees around us. The beam of light was weak, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond a few meters. The steps continued, interspersed with long moments of silence, as if whoever or whatever was out there was trying to be discreet. When I shined the light toward the edge of the clearing, I couldn't see anything but the shadows of trees and dense vegetation. My friends started moving too, grabbing flashlights and trying to locate the source of the sounds. The fire was already dying down, the flames now weaker and casting distorted shadows around the area. The sounds grew louder, now clearer and closer. It seemed as if the person, or whatever it was deliberately walking around the camp, methodically. The slow pace of the steps made the situation even more unnerving. There was no rush, as if the intention was to intimidate us, to make us nervous. At one point, the steps suddenly stopped, and silence took over again. We stood still, alert for any other sound. Then a sharp noise of a branch breaking echoed from the other side of the clearing. My flashlight found a figure among the trees. It was the same figure we had seen earlier, standing now closer. He was watching us again, motionless, making no sound. He observed us for a few minutes, then disappeared into the darkness again. The silence returned for a long while, and we decided to go to sleep. When the footsteps returned, they were clearer and closer. I decided not to wait any longer. Grabbing the flashlight firmly, I stood up and stepped out of the fire's glow to try to get a better look at what was happening. In the blackness formed by the trees, I spotted a man standing still. He was holding a piece of wood, an old, partially cracked log that he dragged along the ground. For a moment he stared at me. He said nothing, and his expression was cold, distant, as if he didn't care what he was about to do. Then, without warning, he started running toward me, raising the piece of wood with an awkward but determined movement. The wood scraped the ground as he approached, and the impact of his steps on the earth seemed to resonate through the clearing. The fight broke out immediately. I tried to dodge the first blow, but it came too close. I shouted for my friends, and within seconds, everyone was on their feet, reacting to what was happening. Some grabbed pieces of wood we had gathered for the fire, and the ensuing chaos was fast and frantic. The man, realizing he was no longer dealing with just one person, hesitated. He turned and ran into the forest, disappearing among the trees. No one followed him. We stood there for a few seconds, panting and silent, trying to process what had just happened. After the attack, we decided we couldn't stay there. The forest seemed to have changed completely since we arrived. The sense of isolation, which had once been a relief, now made us feel vulnerable. We quickly broke camp, extinguishing the fire and packing what we could into our backpacks in the car. Every noise in the woods around us seemed like a warning, as if the man could return at any moment, or maybe he had never left. As we organized everything, we heard distant screams echoing through the trees. It was hard to tell how many people were in the forest, or where exactly the sounds were coming from. We didn't know if that man was alone, or if there was someone else watching us. The idea that we could be surrounded pushed us to move even faster. We got into the car and sped down the dirt road without looking back. The forest was left behind, but the feeling of danger still lingered in the air. During the drive back to the city, we barely exchanged words. What had started as a simple trip to escape routine had turned into a memory we all wanted to forget. It was a hot summer day when I decided to go to Lucas's birthday party. He had recently moved to a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees and a few well-spaced houses. The house, with its white facade and large windows, looked inviting, and the yard had been prepared for the party, with colorful balloons tied to the fences and tables set up under the shade of a large tree. When I arrived, loud music was already echoing through the area, mixed with the sound of guests laughing. The atmosphere was light, and everyone seemed happy, chatting and enjoying themselves. There was a pleasant smell in the air, coming from the food Lucas had prepared on the grill. My friends were scattered around the yard, and I quickly joined them, enjoying the company and good food. The party was lively, but over time I noticed something in the neighborhood seemed a little off. As I chatted and laughed, I couldn't help but notice a man standing across the street, leaning against a sturdy tree. He was watching the party, dressed casually, but there was something about his expression that made me uneasy. His fixed gaze seemed to follow every move my friends and I made, and it bothered me. Amid the fun, a shadow of discomfort began to settle in my mind, making me feel less at ease, even among the laughter and music. As the party continued, trying to shake off the strange feeling the man's presence caused, I began to observe more closely what was happening around me. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the yard, and the shadows started to lengthen. Despite the cheerful environment, the man remained there, leaning against the tree, getting closer to the sidewalk. Then I realized he wasn't just watching. Every few minutes, he would shift position, as if slowly approaching the party, but always keeping a distance. The contrast between the fun and the uneasiness I felt was striking. My friends were completely oblivious to this, immersed in conversations and music, while I felt a growing urgency to understand what was happening. I decided to ignore it for a while, trying to focus on the conversations and laughter. However, the sight of the man kept pulling me back to reality. I caught glimpses of him, his expression unchanged, as if he was evaluating the situation. What was supposed to be a night of celebration was starting to turn into a subtle nightmare. When the music switched to a slower track, a momentary silence fell among the guests, and I took the chance to glance at the man again. He was now closer, almost at the edge of the street, and his gaze seemed locked on me. That visual connection unsettled me, and I realized it was impossible to ignore the strangeness of the situation. I decided to stay alert, but at the same time, I didn't want to cause a scene among my friends, knowing it could ruin the party. As the party was in full swing, the tension I felt regarding the man grew with each passing moment. He was nearing the house, now just a few meters away. Although the laughter and music continued to echo, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Each time I looked at him, his expression remained unchanged, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made me uneasy. While talking to some friends, I kept an eye on the stranger. He seemed to be paying close attention to me, as if waiting for a move, an opportunity. The festive atmosphere began to fade around me, and the voices became mere background noise. The man, now closer, began to move slowly, always keeping a safe distance but advancing in my direction. I decided to step away from the party, pretending I was going to get something inside the house. As I entered the hallway, I noticed the atmosphere inside was very different. The sounds of the party grew faint and the silence felt heavier. I looked out the window and saw the man now leaning against the yard fence, watching every move I made. He had gotten so close that it was now impossible to ignore him. As I tried to compose myself, a chill ran down my spine. He had crossed the line that separated the sidewalk from the property. What did he want? The answer wasn't clear, but the unease inside me grew. I quickly left the hallway, trying to ignore his presence, but his image remained etched in my mind. Something told me the party was about to turn into something far more dangerous. While the party continued outside, I decided I needed to use the bathroom. The house was decorated with colorful balloons and streamers, but I couldn't focus on the celebrations anymore. I walked down the narrow hallway, surrounded by old paintings and a worn carpet, until I reached the bathroom door. As soon as I closed the door, a momentary sense of relief washed over me. But as I prepared myself, a sudden noise at the door made me freeze. It sounded like someone trying to open the door, a subtle but insistent sound. The noise wasn't ordinary. There was pressure, as if someone was forcing their way in. The voices from the party seemed distant, and the loud music couldn't drown out what was happening behind that door. The oppressive silence took over the bathroom as I tried to understand what was going on. I looked out the small window and saw the sky darkening outside, but my mind was focused on the sound that intensified. "Hey, is everything okay in there?" A muffled voice came from the other side, but it wasn't one of my friends. It was deeper, strange, and I didn't recognize it. A wave of nervousness swept through me. The stranger was there, on the other side of the door, and he seemed determined to get in. I decided I couldn't just sit there waiting. I tried to stay calm as I quickly looked for an exit. The bathroom was small, and the only window was tiny, but it was my only chance. The noise at the door continued, now with a stronger knock, as if the patience of the intruder was running out. With adrenaline pumping, I opened the window and saw the yard, where the recent rain had left the ground wet and slippery. There was no time to hesitate. I knew I had to act quickly before he managed to get in. Looking at the yard, a mix of fear and urgency overwhelmed me. The recent rain had left the ground covered in puddles, reflecting the party lights in the distance. I knew I couldn't waste any more time. The noise at the door was growing louder, echoing in my mind like a constant warning. He was determined to get in, and the idea of being trapped there was unbearable. With the window open, I decided that the only viable option was to jump. I took a deep breath and positioned myself on the window ledge, trying to calculate the best way to fall. The ground seemed farther than it actually was, and I wondered if this was a smart choice. However, the sound of the door being forced reminded me that time was running out. He wouldn't take long to get in. I threw myself outside. The fall was harder than I expected, and the impact on the slippery ground caused my body to slide a little. I quickly got up, ignoring the pain and confusion. I looked back, but there was no sign of the man trying to break in. He was still inside, but I didn't know how long he could be held back. The party continued in the distance, the laughter and music seeming almost unreal in that tense moment. I headed toward the fence that separated the yard from the next, thinking about how I could find help. The surrounding houses were dark, and a sinking feeling set in as I realized I might be completely alone. I glanced at my friend's house, which seemed distant and impenetrable. Going back there was a risky option, as the stranger might already have come out. I decided to run down the sidewalk, looking for anywhere I could hide. Adrenaline pushed me forward, and the only clear thing in my mind was the need to escape the situation before it was too late. I ran down the sidewalk, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The park was closer than I thought, and the idea of taking refuge under the lit-up areas offered me a small relief. However, when I looked back, I saw the man leaving the house, his eyes fixed on me. He had spotted me. The expression on his face left no doubt about his intentions. Calming my mind was impossible, and the only thing I could think of was putting distance between us. The street felt endless, and panic began to spread through my mind. The park was my only hope, but each step felt heavier than the last. He was following me, his steady, determined footsteps echoing behind me. There was no room for hesitation. The park lights became more visible, and I quickened my pace, crossing the street in a hurry. The ground was wet, and I nearly slipped in a puddle. The sight of the lights encouraged me to keep going, even as the anxiety intensified. I didn't know what he wanted, but it didn't seem like a good idea to find out. As I entered the park, I looked for a place to hide. The large trees offered some cover, and I squeezed between the trunks, trying to stay out of sight. The sound of the party still echoed in the distance, but the reality was that I was alone. The park, once inviting, now felt like a trap. I heard his footsteps approaching. He was searching for me, and adrenaline shot through my body. The silence in the park was oppressive, broken only by the sound of leaves being crushed underfoot. He was close, and I needed to find a way out. Desperation grew as I looked around, trying to quickly think of a plan. However, as I moved to a new position, a branch snapped under my feet. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet night, and I held my breath, hoping he hadn't heard me. My heart raced as I realized that even hidden, there was no guarantee of my safety. Desperation turned into a fight for survival, and the only thing I knew was that I needed to act before he found me. As I hid among the trees, the sound of his footsteps getting closer made me realize that time was running out. He was near, and I had to quickly decide what to do. The park, which once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a maze, where every shadow seemed to move threateningly. With a stealthy move, I decided to leave my hiding spot. The only option was to run again. The park lights offered some safety, but the darkness around them seemed to close in. As I ran, I heard a scream coming from the direction of the party. It wasn't a cry for help, but carefree laughter, as if everything was fine. The disconnect between that sound and the reality I was living made me feel even more anxious. I looked back and saw the man stop, seemingly hesitating. It was as if he was assessing his next move. In a moment of clarity, I realized I needed to do something unexpected to confuse him. I ran toward a group of trees, and instead of continuing, I hid behind a thick trunk. He was following me, but when he noticed I had disappeared, his expression changed. He looked around, frustrated, as if trying to figure out where I might have gone. The silence of the park was broken by a new wave of sounds, this time louder. Someone was approaching, possibly another person in the park. My chance of being saved was getting closer. He seemed distracted, and I seized that opportunity to move toward the park's exit, following a path that led to the main street. When I finally reached the exit, I breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing a few people walking by, distracted and laughing, as if nothing was happening. I ran toward them, shouting for help, and the man, realizing he had lost his target, disappeared into the darkness. The party remained lively, but for me, everything had changed. The relief of being surrounded by people caused the adrenaline to subside, but the feeling that something sinister had happened wouldn't leave me. It was a beautiful summer afternoon, perfect for an outdoor walk. I chose a secluded trail in the middle of the forest, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The environment around me was calming, with tall trees forming a green canopy, allowing only a few rays of sunlight to pierce through and illuminate the dirt path. The scent of fresh vegetation and the gentle sound of leaves rustling in the wind created a relaxing atmosphere. The only sound accompanying my footsteps was the crunch of dry leaves beneath my feet, along with the distant song of a few birds. After walking for a while, I passed a couple heading in the opposite direction. They greeted me with a wave and a smile, but soon disappeared among the trees. After that, I noticed the solitude of the trail seemed to intensify. There was no one else around, and the silence surrounding me began to feel more palpable, as if the forest were watching my every move. As I continued, the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. The light gradually dimmed, and a slight breeze brought a chill that cut through the warm tranquility of the day. Although I had been eager for this solitary walk, a small feeling that something was off began to gnaw at me. The trees seemed to close in around me, and a subtle discomfort settled at the back of my mind. The trail was eerily empty, and the sensation that I was the only inhabitant of this forest grew with every step I took. As I walked along the trail, I began to feel a growing unease. At first, I thought it was just the excessive silence around me, but as time passed, the feeling became more concrete. At the previous fork where I had chosen the path to the right, a thought struck me. Someone was watching me. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the unease persisted, like a shadow that refused to disappear. I glanced to the sides, trying to spot any movement among the trees, but everything seemed still, almost unreal. The leaves, which had once swayed gently in the wind, now seemed frozen in time. There was a tension in the air, an expectation I couldn't name. I kept walking, but each step felt as if I were being followed by an unknown, invisible gaze. I looked ahead, but couldn't avoid glancing back several times. The trail, which had once seemed familiar and friendly, now had an air of mystery and oppression. The trees, with their thick trunks and dense vegetation, seemed to hide secrets I wasn't prepared to discover. My heart raced slightly as I imagined what might be lurking in the shadows. Then I heard something that made me even more uneasy. A distant snap, like someone stepping on a dry branch, echoed through the forest. Instantly, my attention turned to the direction the sound had come from. There was nothing visible, but the sensation that someone was following me or that someone was nearby couldn't be ignored. The air felt heavier, and the awareness of my solitude turned into a warning. The trail was growing darker, and I wasn't sure if it was just the daylight fading or if something else was approaching. The path ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly, but the feeling that something was wrong kept growing. Every step I took seemed to echo on the silent trail, and the snap I had heard earlier still reverberated in my mind. I decided to quicken my pace, but this only intensified the perception that something was following me. It was then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, that I heard another sound, this time clearer and more defined. It was the noise of heavy footsteps, seemingly drawing closer, as if someone were following in my tracks. I stopped suddenly and looked back, but the dense vegetation and the shadows of the trees revealed nothing. However, the atmosphere had become oppressive, and a twinge of fear began to creep into my mind. I kept moving forward, but the trail grew narrower. The trees seemed to close in around me, as if the forest were turning into a labyrinth. The fresh air grew colder, and every movement I made echoed in the unsettling silence. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my breathing and the rustle of leaves beneath my feet. Suddenly, I saw a silhouette among the trees in the distance. The figure was standing still, watching, only partially illuminated by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the treetops. The sight caused a knot to form in my stomach. I couldn't make out whether it was a man or a woman, but there was something unsettling about the way they remained motionless, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to ignore it, but the presence of this figure followed me, like a shadow. When I looked again, the silhouette had vanished, but the feeling of being watched never left my mind. With each step I took, the forest seemed to grow more hostile, and the idea that I wasn't alone became increasingly real. I tried to convince myself it was just another casual hiker, but my intuition told me otherwise. Something inside me knew I was in danger. The unease that had once been a mild hunch had now turned into a state of alert. With the silhouette gone, I had hoped relief would wash over me, but the opposite happened. The feeling of being followed intensified. The echo of my footsteps seemed louder, and with every snap of a branch beneath my feet, a wave of anxiety hit me. I decided to pick up the pace, but that only caused a louder snap behind me. I glanced back again and saw the figure closer, with an expression that blended determination and malice. The shadow that once seemed harmless was now a predator, and realizing this put me on high alert. The trail became more difficult. The roots and thick vegetation made it hard to move. The sun was setting, and the light guiding me was fading, giving way to unsettling shadows. I needed a safe place, and the cabin I had spotted earlier became the only viable option. The heavy footsteps behind me grew louder. Panic started to creep in, but I knew I couldn't give up. Finally, I reached an open spot on the trail, where the cabin stood in sight. Without hesitation, I ran toward it, adrenaline driving me forward. I threw open the wooden door, entered, and slammed it shut. The feeling of being isolated in that empty space was both a relief and a sign that the fight was just beginning. As I entered the cabin, I closed the door with a bang that echoed through the empty interior. The place smelled of mold and aged wood, and the dim light made everything seem more sinister. The walls were covered with dusty shelves, and the floor was made of creaky wooden planks. The ensuing silence was almost deafening, and I knew I couldn't relax. I searched for a place to hide, but the cabin was simple, with few furnishings. An old wooden table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs that had seen better days. At the back, a small dirty window let in some light, but not enough to dispel the approaching darkness. The place looked abandoned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more there. While I hid behind the table, I heard the man's footsteps approaching. The sound of the floor creaking under his weight put me on high alert. He began circling the cabin, his presence outside making the tension grow. I couldn't see his face, but his image remained sharp in my mind. Shadows danced around him as he searched for me, and the anticipation of an imminent confrontation was palpable. I felt the urge to run again, but there was no way out. The only exit was behind him, and the thought of facing that terrifying figure paralyzed me. I tried to listen to his movements, each of his steps making my heart race. He finally stopped in front of the back window. It was a small opening, but I knew if he managed to get in, there would be no escape. The hope that he would give up was an illusion. I heard a crack coming from the window and realized he had found a way in. Fear took over as he moved with precision. The only thing I could do was brace myself for the worst and wait for the opportunity to react. The atmosphere in the cabin was oppressive, and the certainty that a fight for survival was about to happen kept me on edge. The door creaked lightly as he pushed it, but it didn't open. Instead, he went to the window he had found, and the glass shattered under the pressure of his body. The fragile sense of security I thought I had was quickly unraveling. He climbed in swiftly, his figure casting a threatening shadow in the faint light filtering through the broken window. I held my breath as he moved around the cabin, his eyes scanning every corner, searching for me. The feeling of being cornered intensified. He had a knife in his hand, reflecting the little light that entered, and that made me realize I couldn't hesitate. It was a matter of life or death. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. As soon as he turned his back, I ran toward him. A quick, decisive movement, as if adrenaline had completely taken over me. He turned, surprised, but the element of surprise was mine. The impact of my body against his made him drop the knife from his hands. We started fighting. The blows were thrown with strength and precision, and I tried to dodge his attacks while struggling to keep him at bay. He was stronger than I had imagined, and every move demanded all my effort. I managed to dodge, but some of his strikes hit me, marking my skin, not causing serious wounds, but making it clear that time was running out. As the fight continued, I noticed the table was beside us. In a swift move, I shoved him, causing him to hit his head against the nearby wall. I took the opportunity and ran for the door, but he quickly recovered and began to get up. Time was against me, and the thought of being trapped there terrified me, but adrenaline was on my side. As soon as he stood up, I realized I had a chance. He was dazed, and I bolted toward the exit. With a final push, I managed to open the door and escape, leaving the cabin and the fight behind. The forest seemed denser as I ran, the branches intertwining as if trying to hold me back. The sound of my footsteps muffled by the ground covered in dry leaves, mixed with the noise of the wind between the trees. Adrenaline still pumped through my veins, and the urgency to distance myself from that place grew with every passing moment. I looked back but didn't see the pursuer. What I didn't know was whether he was still following me or had given up. The fear of being caught forced me to keep going. I ran toward a narrower path between the trees, which led back to the city. It was the last day of college, and the campus was buzzing with activity. Classmates laughed and said their goodbyes in the hallways, discussing their plans for the upcoming break. I shared in the excitement, but I still had one last task to complete. Before joining the farewells, I headed to the library to turn in my final assignment. The library was housed in an old building, with imposing architecture and shelves that seemed to touch the ceiling, full of books aged by time. The flickering fluorescent lights gave the place a slightly unsettling air, despite the comforting smell of old paper. The atmosphere inside was very different from the hustle and bustle outside. Most of the students had already left, and the silence was only interrupted by the soft rustling of pages and the occasional click of computer keyboards. I walked over to a table in the corner, sat down, and quickly focused on my work. The library, though somewhat gloomy, had always been a place where I could easily concentrate, and this would be the last academic effort before closing out the semester. When I finished, I looked at the clock and realized it was already past 9 at night. The library was almost deserted now. I gathered my materials, packed everything into my backpack, and prepared to leave, imagining I would soon be outside, ready to enjoy the light-hearted atmosphere of the end of the semester. After packing up and standing from the table, I noticed just how empty the library was. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of rain starting to fall outside. The absence of other people, which I hadn't noticed before, now became evident. As I walked through the aisles, the echo of my own footsteps seemed amplified, reverberating through the towering shelves. It was as if the vast space full of books had turned into an expansive void. I headed for the main exit. The feeling of solitude grew with every step. I passed several empty shelves and tables, seeing no one. The librarian who usually sat at the reception desk seemed to have already left, which unsettled me a bit. It was strange to be there, alone, in such a large, silent building. I glanced toward the entrance, expecting to see another student or staff member, but the lobby was completely deserted. The environment, once cozy, now made me feel isolated, as if the place had closed around me without me realizing. I reached the main door with the intention of leaving, but when I tried to push it, it wouldn't budge. I frowned and pulled the handle, but nothing. The door was locked. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe I was turning the handle the wrong way, or it was stuck. But after several attempts, it became clear. I was locked in. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening. It was common for the library to close late at night, but it never occurred to me that someone might lock up without checking if there were still people inside. I went to the reception desk to look for the staff member, but the counter was empty. The computer was off and the reception lights were out, signaling that everyone had already left. I started banging on the door, hoping a security guard was making rounds outside. Nothing. No response. The sound echoed through the building, and the only thing I could hear was the rain tapping against the windows. As I moved away from the main entrance and walked through the empty aisles of the library, the atmosphere seemed to change. The fluorescent lights flickered irregularly, casting quick, distorted shadows on the shelves. With each electrical crackle, the corridor briefly plunged into darkness, creating a sense of vulnerability. The silence, once comforting, now felt oppressive. The muffled sound of the rain outside mixed with the sound of my own footsteps, which echoed strangely loudly. I began to get the feeling that I was no longer alone. The sense that someone or something was watching me grew with each passing moment, but no matter how much I looked around, I didn't see anyone. I passed several rows of bookshelves, and at each corner, I expected to find someone, some staff member or student who might have stayed behind. But the place was deserted. The hallway ahead seemed to stretch longer, and the sound of footsteps, heavier than mine, started to blend with my own. Hurriedly, I made my way toward a door that led to the back of the library, hoping to find an alternative exit. When I pushed it open, I found a narrow, dimly lit corridor, very different from the main areas. The walls were lined with old metal shelves, crammed with dusty books and forgotten boxes. The musty smell in the air revealed the abandonment of that space. The light was faint, and the bulbs flickered constantly as if they were about to burn out for good. Every creak of the shelves seemed amplified by the silence of the place. I walked down the corridor, looking for an exit, but every door I found was locked or blocked by piles of books. The space felt like a trap. As I advanced, I heard the sound of footsteps again, this time more distinct and closer. I quickly turned my head, but the corridor was empty. Even so, the feeling of being followed didn't fade. I approached the last door at the far end, my last hope, but it was locked too. As I turned to leave the corridor, I saw a figure emerging from the shadows, closer than I had expected. It was a man, his features hard and expressionless, as if his presence there was intentional and premeditated. He moved toward me quickly, without saying a word, and grabbed my arm with force. I tried to pull away, but he was strong. The shock made me stumble back, hitting one of the shelves. On impulse, I pushed him with all the strength I could muster. He staggered back but regained his balance quickly. Before I could run, he came at me again, knocking me to the ground with a kick that made my legs give out. I felt the hard impact of the floor, and as I tried to get up, he was already on top of me, trying to pin me down. I fought back with everything I had. I saw a small ceramic jar on one of the nearby shelves. I grabbed it without hesitation and smashed it over his head. The impact was solid, and the man staggered back, clutching his head as he fell to the ground, dazed. That was my chance. I took advantage of his distraction and ran toward the door that led to the library's exit. The adrenaline pumped through my veins as I twisted the handle, which was still locked. My eyes darted frantically, searching for another way out, but time seemed to be running out. That's when I noticed a shadow moving behind me. The man was getting up, and his expression now was one of pure rage. In a panic, I started banging on the door, shouting for help. The echo of my voice reverberated through the empty library, mixing with the sound of the rain pouring outside. That was when I saw one of the library staff, who had been getting ready to leave. He looked at me with a confused expression, but before I could explain, he rushed over to the door and, with a quick motion, opened it. The light from outside felt like an invitation to freedom. Without looking back, I rushed through the door and ran onto the campus. The rain soaked me, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to put distance between myself and that place. As I ran, the feeling of being free began to wash over me, despite the terror I had just experienced. The library was left behind, and with it, the threat that had almost turned my last day of school into a nightmare. I reached the parking lot, out of breath and drenched, but relieved. The sun was still setting, and even in the midst of the chaos, there was beauty in that moment. I knew I would never look at the library the same way again. What was supposed to be a day of celebration had turned into a lesson that sometimes what seems safe can hide unimaginable dangers. It was a cool and silent night when I decided it was time to head home. The party I had just left was full of laughter and loud music, a vibrant contrast to the deserted street that stretched out before me. The night air was filled with the scent of damp grass, and the light breeze brought with it a sense of calm. However, as I walked, a sense of unease began to settle in. The moon was partially covered by clouds, casting shadows that danced on the empty sidewalks. I could feel the cold beginning to bite, making the walk more uncomfortable. It was the last day of school, and the excitement from the party still pulsed within me, but the reality of the solitary, deserted path began to sink in. I looked around, hoping to spot some sign of life, but only the sound of the wind broke the silence. The decision to hitchhike seemed increasingly sensible, as the distance to my house felt long and uninhabited. Without knowing what to expect, I stuck out my thumb, hoping some kind driver would appear to offer me help. The darkness around me grew deeper, and the discomfort started to rise, instigating a sense of vulnerability that I couldn't ignore. After a few minutes of waiting, I saw the lights of a truck approaching. The vehicle stopped beside me, and the driver, a man with a friendly appearance, greeted me with a smile that seemed sincere. He had disheveled hair and a patchy beard, but his gaze conveyed a sense of trustworthiness. My heart beat a little faster, but the desire to escape the solitude of the night won out. "Where are you headed?" he asked as I got into the cab. I replied that I was heading near my home, and he quickly offered to take me. The interior of the truck was clean, but there was a strong smell of cigarettes mixed with coffee, a scent that seemed to be ingrained in the upholstery. As the truck started moving, the conversation initially flowed in a relaxed manner. He asked questions about the party, how it had been, if I had fun. But as we talked, I started to notice that his questions seemed to delve too deep. He wanted to know details about my friends, where I studied, and even about my personal life. A slight sense of discomfort began to grow inside me, but I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. The road ahead stretched out desolate, and I watched as the city lights faded in the distance. The man drove calmly, but the way he leaned in closer as he spoke began to unsettle me. It was as if he was trying to connect in a way that went beyond a simple ride. The silence that followed between his questions felt heavy, and the once light conversation took on a different tone, almost as if he were evaluating something I couldn't yet understand. The road began to narrow as we moved further from the city. The atmosphere in the truck changed, and I sensed that something wasn't right. The driver, who had seemed so friendly before, now wore a different smile, almost forced. He began glancing away from the road, but his questions became more insistent and personal. "Do you have boyfriends?" he asked casually, but the intensity in his gaze contradicted the lightness of the question. I felt a knot in my stomach, a silent warning that his intentions might not be as innocent as they seemed. I tried to change the subject, but he wasn't deterred. He started talking about his experiences at parties and how he was always interested in young people who went out at night. It was then that I realized we were taking a detour. I looked out the window and noticed the road was becoming increasingly isolated, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to close in, creating an oppressive atmosphere. The sound of the truck's engine echoed into the night, and the conversation that had once seemed like a friendly exchange now felt like a subtle trap. "You're not scared to be out at night, are you?" he said with a tone that seemed to tease the situation. I just laughed nervously, trying to mask the discomfort settling within me. His laugh in response sounded strange, almost sinister. The air inside the truck felt denser, and the tension began to grow. The feeling of being lost became palpable when he started to speed up, driving down a path I didn't recognize. I looked to the side and realized there were no more houses, just dense forest stretching in all directions. Desperation started to take hold of me, and the urge to get out of that situation grew with each passing second. I knew I needed to stay calm and look for an opportunity to escape before it was too late. With every mile we drove, the road became rougher, and the environment more oppressive. I looked out the window and saw the trees closing in around us, as if they were trying to swallow the truck. The silence outside the vehicle was unnerving, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the pounding of my heart, which seemed to echo in the tense air. "Are we going somewhere different?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though the anxiety seeped through my words. The driver just laughed, a sound more like a grunt. "Just taking a shortcut. Don't worry, you're gonna love the place." The discomfort grew as he made driving decisions that didn't make sense. The road, now full of potholes, started to feel like an abandoned trail. I looked around, trying to recognize any landmark, but all I could see were shadows and dense vegetation growing increasingly hostile. The conversation, once light, was now filled with unsettling comments. He talked about how fun it was to explore isolated places and how some people weren't afraid to get lost. I felt a lump in my throat and forced myself to respond evasively, trying not to feed into the dark atmosphere. "This is quite an adventure, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and insinuating. My instinct started screaming, and I realized he was moving further away from the route that would take me home. What had started as a simple ride was turning into a nightmare. The thought that he might have other intentions beyond taking me home wouldn't leave my mind. With each turn, the tension rose, and I mentally prepared myself for what might come next. Adrenaline coursed through me as I began to think about how I could escape from that truck before it was too late. I looked at the door, assessing the possibility of jumping out before the situation became even more critical. As the road narrowed and the shadows deepened, a growing sense of panic settled in my chest. The driver, who had once seemed kind and friendly, now emanated an air of unease. He drove with a disturbing confidence, almost as if he was satisfied with our current route. The conversation that had once flowed naturally was now interrupted by awkward silences, where only the sound of the engine and the crackling of the cigarette smoke he repeatedly lit could be heard. The smell of tobacco mixed with the strong aroma of coffee intensified, creating a suffocating atmosphere. Each time he took a drag, the tension in the air seemed to increase. I looked outside again, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of threat. The rain began to fall, pounding insistently on the glass, and visibility diminished. What had been just a dirt road now seemed like a dark labyrinth. That's when he started talking about the past. With a disturbing smile, he mentioned stories of people who had disappeared in places like that. "Some say the silence of the forest is deafening, that you never know what's lurking," he said, laughing in an almost manic way. My stomach churned. His words became a silent warning, a confirmation that I wasn't in an ordinary situation. I felt my heart race as he made a sharp turn and stopped. "I think we need a moment to appreciate the view," he said, looking at me with a strange glint in his eyes. A chill ran down my spine. The feeling of danger was palpable, as if every cell in my body was alerting me that I needed to escape. I looked out the window and realized there were no houses, no signs of civilization nearby, just trees and darkness. The cold of the night intensified, and the sound of the rain mixed with the noise of my heart beating in despair. Adrenaline began to flow, and I knew I needed to act before it was too late. As soon as the truck stopped, a chill ran through my body. The driver turned to me with a smile that now seemed grotesque, and the tension in the cabin was palpable. With a quick movement, he leaned closer, the expression on his face shifting from false friendliness to a menacing desire. "Do you mind if I show you something?" he asked, his voice now lower and drawn out. Fear overtook me, and my instincts screamed that I needed to get out of there. Without thinking, I reached for the door handle, but realized it was locked. A sudden panic flooded my system. He noticed my movement and laughed. "It's not that easy to leave, is it?" His laughter echoed in the cabin, and the heavy atmosphere left me stunned. What had been a simple ride had now turned into a nightmare. The situation worsened when he started moving, opening a compartment under the driver's seat. My heart raced when I saw that he pulled out a small, shiny knife, gleaming under the faint interior light of the truck. "Just for safety," he said, winking. His laughter sounded like a distant echo, making my stomach turn. Without thinking twice, I finally went into survival mode. As he moved closer, I quickly shifted my body to the side and tried to open the door, but he was faster. He grabbed my arm tightly, trying to pull me back. Desperation took over, and a wave of adrenaline made me fight. With a swift motion, I managed to push him back, seizing the moment of surprise to open the door. I jumped out of the truck, landing awkwardly on the muddy ground. The sound of the rain was deafening, and my mind was in a whirlwind as I ran in the opposite direction of the truck. But the driver wasn't deterred. He came after me, shouting something I couldn't understand. The biting cold of the night and the slippery ground made the escape even more difficult. The trees seemed to close in, their distorted shadows creating a surreal and terrifying scene. I looked back and saw his figure getting closer, the gleaming knife reflecting the little light there was. The distance between us was closing quickly, and I knew I needed to find a place to hide. My eyes quickly fixed on a nearby thicket. I ran towards it, trying to stay out of reach of the light coming from the truck. I slipped into the darkness, my heart pounding as I heard his heavy footsteps approaching. I knew time was running out, and I needed to hide before he caught up to me. I hid behind a tree, my hot, rapid breath mixing with the cold night air. The sound of my heartbeat seemed deafening, and all I could think about was escaping the situation. The driver ran past, and I knew I only had a moment to act. He was getting closer, but I wasn't going to give up so easily. The driver moved further away, and the silence enveloped the thicket. I took the opportunity and crept backward, trying not to make any noise as I distanced myself from the main path. The ground was uneven and covered with wet leaves, but I knew I had to keep moving. Every step was a battle against fear and pain, especially as I felt my twisted ankle begging for rest. I could still hear the sound of the truck's engine in the distance, but the rain was starting to intensify, muffling other noises. I knew the man could return at any moment, so I couldn't allow myself to relax. As I limped, I searched for any sign of civilization. That's when I saw a road and thought, it's going to be a long way home. It was an autumn night, and I was home alone, watching a movie. The television illuminated the room, but the rest of the house was cloaked in shadows. The rain beat incessantly against the windows, and the wind howled outside. I wasn't worried about anything until the phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw it was an unknown number. I hesitated but answered. On the other end, I heard heavy breathing, but no one said anything. Just silence. I was confused and hung up, thinking it was some prank. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. It was the same number. This time, I didn't answer. My heart began to race as curiosity consumed me. What was happening? I decided to ignore it and return to the movie. But the unease wouldn't leave me alone. The rain continued, and the wind seemed more intense. I looked out the window and noticed the streetlight flickering, casting strange shadows in the yard. That's when I heard a noise coming from the front door. Someone was knocking. The first thing I thought was that it could be a friend or a neighbor in need of help. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. I didn't see anyone, just the darkness of the night. I hesitated, but decided to open the door. When I did, I found an envelope on the ground. No name, no address, just a folded piece of paper. I picked up the envelope and went back inside, sitting on the couch. When I opened it, I found a single sentence: "I'm watching you." The blood froze in my veins. I looked around, feeling as though invisible eyes were fixed on me. The phone rang again, and this time I couldn't ignore it. I answered, but all I heard was the same heavy breathing on the other end. The unease overwhelmed me, and I knew something was very wrong. The phone rang again, interrupting the heavy silence of the house. I looked at the screen and saw that same unknown number again. A chill ran down my spine. The first time I answered, there was only heavy breathing. Now the anticipation of what might happen next made me anxious. I hesitated, remembering the uncomfortable feeling that overcame me when I hung up the last time. My heart was racing, and my mind was filled with questions. Who was this person? Why were they calling me? Was it just a bad prank or something more serious? Finally, with some effort, I picked up the phone and answered. "Hello." My voice came out shakier than I expected. The silence on the other end was deafening, and then I heard that heavy breathing again. It was as if someone was watching me, waiting for me to say something else. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to stay calm. There was no response, just the continuous breathing, almost like an echo, filling the line. Fear began to set in. I abruptly hung up the phone, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. I went to the window and looked outside, but all I saw was the darkness of the night and the rain falling. I tried to distract myself, but the unease only intensified. The movie I was watching couldn't hold my attention. I looked at the phone, wondering how I could get out of this situation. The rain seemed to grow stronger, pounding on the windows as if the world outside was just as unsettled as I felt inside. After a few minutes of anguish, the phone rang once again. I felt a lump in my throat, but I couldn't ignore it. I answered again, my breathing quickening. "Hello?" This time my tone was firmer. But once again, there was only that same heavy breathing on the other end, like a shadow waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The phone rang again, breaking the silence that dominated the room. By this point, I knew it wasn't a mere coincidence. With each ring, my heart seemed to race more, as if I was in a constant state of alert. I looked at the screen and confirmed it was the same unknown number, and hesitation gripped me. Why won't he stop? I thought. But curiosity was stronger than fear. I took a deep breath and answered, already expecting the same heavy breathing on the other end. "Hello?" My voice came out almost as a whisper, full of nervousness. And as expected, there was no response. Only that breathing, which seemed to intensify, like something lurking, anxious for me to say something more. I hung up once again, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. With each subsequent ring, a wave of despair enveloped me. I was home alone, and that incessant phone call was making everything more disturbing. I looked out the window, trying to distract myself with the falling rain. The droplets slid down the glass, but even the rain couldn't drown out the sound of my racing heart. With each ring of the phone, a new wave of anxiety took over me. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but I couldn't shake the growing unease. The silence that followed each call seemed to scream. Each time I answered, the heavy breathing became a reminder that something wasn't right. I knew I needed to do something, but I didn't know exactly what. Finally, I made the decision not to answer anymore. Hearing that persistent ring once more, I decided to put the phone aside and return to the couch. But my mind couldn't stop thinking about those calls. I looked around the room. Every shadow seemed denser, every outside noise more threatening. What I was about to discover would change my perception of that night forever. The rain poured incessantly outside, and the wind made the trees sway unsettlingly. I tried to focus on the movie still playing on the screen, but the unease wouldn't leave me. With each flash of lightning illuminating the room, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, and I wondered if I was truly alone. That's when I began to hear strange noises. At first, it was just the sound of the rain, but then I realized there was something more. A subtle creaking coming from the front door, as if someone was knocking softly. My heart raced. I knew no one else was home. It was a winter night, and most of my neighbors had gone to their own parties or were sheltering from the cold. The noises grew louder, a light scratching followed by a louder sound, as if something was being moved. I glanced at the phone, now silent, but the feeling that something was about to happen began to take hold of me. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole, but saw no one. The hallway was shrouded in shadows, and the streetlight flickered, casting ghostly shapes in the darkness. I returned to the couch, but the unease intensified. Every sound made my heart race. Then I heard a louder noise coming from the kitchen, like something had fallen. I felt an impulse to investigate, but the thought of leaving the couch and facing the darkness of the house terrified me. I tried to focus, to ignore the sounds, but the tension was palpable. The wind howled outside, and every movement inside the house seemed amplified. What was that noise? Was I just imagining things, or was something real? The uncertainty was becoming unbearable, and I wondered if it was just my state of mind, or if there truly was something or someone moving in the shadows. With every sound echoing in the house, I realized the night was far from peaceful. The unease continued, and I could no longer concentrate on the movie. The sound of the rain seemed to grow louder, and the shadows danced on the walls of the living room. That's when I heard something different, a soft knock on the front door. My body tensed, and I walked to the door, hesitant. The light in the hallway was dim, flickering slightly. I looked through the peephole, but once again, saw no one. The cold from outside made me shiver, but when I looked down, I saw something on the ground, right in front of the door. It was an envelope. Strangely, there was no name, no recipient, just a simple folded piece of paper inside. At first, I thought it might be a mistake, a misdelivered letter from a neighbor, but it wasn't common to leave things like that without knocking or ringing the bell. I picked up the envelope, went back inside, and sat on the couch. The atmosphere felt even heavier, the tension in the air almost tangible. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope, and inside was a single handwritten sentence. "I'm watching you." That simple but disturbing sentence made the blood freeze in my veins. I looked around, trying to control my breathing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Who had left that? How did they know where I lived? And most importantly, what did they want from me? The phone rang again, interrupting my thoughts. I was still processing what I had just read when the phone rang once more. This time, I let it ring until it stopped. There was no way I could answer after that message. My body was tense, and my eyes constantly darted to the window and the door, as if expecting something worse. That's when I heard the sound, a metallic noise, like someone fiddling with the front door's lock. I froze for a moment, my thoughts in disarray. I walked slowly to the door, looked through the peephole, and there he was, a man, crouched over the lock, trying to break in. My heart raced, but without making a sound, I stepped back from the door and pushed the couch to block it. With every second, the noise at the lock grew louder, as if he was getting closer to opening it. I grabbed the phone and called the police, whispering the situation, terrified he might hear any sound outside. While speaking to the dispatcher, I ran to the bedroom and locked the door. Seconds later, I heard the front door being forced, but he didn't manage to get in. However, what came next made my stomach sink, a loud crash at the back door, the sound of wood giving way. He had found another entrance. I could hear his heavy footsteps in the hallway. He was walking through the house, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Every sound outside the bedroom heightened my alertness. I locked the door and stepped back, trying to stay calm, but fear overtook me. The phone trembled in my hand as the dispatcher urged me to stay calm and wait for the officers to arrive. Then the inevitable happened. He began pounding on the bedroom door. The knocks were strong, desperate, and each impact seemed to echo through the room. I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. He was determined to get in. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. But when I heard the wood starting to crack, I hid behind the bed, gripping anything I could use to defend myself. I didn't have much time. The door gave way with a loud snap. The man entered the bedroom. He paused for a second, perhaps trying to locate me. My body was still, trying to remain silent, but I knew it was only a matter of seconds before he found me. It was at that moment that I heard the police sirens in the distance. And just as he finally spotted me and started to move toward me, the sound of the police entering the house stopped him. He hesitated. Then I heard quick footsteps echoing through the house, and before he could attack me, the police arrived, overpowering him before he could react. As they took him away, the relief was instant, but I could still feel my body trembling. I knew that if the police had taken a little longer, I might not have had another chance to escape.